All right, good morning, everybody, and welcome to my Jewish Learning's weekly look back at the week in Daf Yomi. It's good to have you with us this morning. Feel free to say hello in the chat if you'd like. We have a half hour this morning to see what to review what we learned this week in Daf Yomi, so I won't take any time with my own chattering. Our presenter this morning is Rabbi Lexi Boatsum, and I will toss it over to her now.
Hey folks, wonderful to see everyone. So we're in the middle of Masachet Shvot, and still for the first several dapim, we are not talking mainly about Shvot, as I'm sure many people have noticed. The first parak and a half of Shvuot is mostly talking about tuma, about impurity in the Beit HaMikdash and when consuming things, etc. That they sort of mentioned, once they mentioned the sort of similarity between two Shvuot that are four and the two impurities that are four, they were like, what if we brought all of the halachot about impurity in the Beit HaMikdash right now, just to get it over with, right? So the first sort of chunk of our learning this past week, we started a new parak right before it on 14, but we're still talking about this idea of when a person's awareness or lapses of awareness, both about their own status of impurity and about the status of either having been in the temple or the status of the consecrated foods that they're eating, and what the liability looks like depending on all these different lapses of awareness. And through that mention, we also get this kind of fun little addition in the Mishnah where it talks about how we expand the boundaries of Jerusalem, right? This becomes relevant because they're talking about like what areas of the temple are sanctified and when they were sanctified. And so, sort of derech agav, sort of incidentally, the Mishnah brings us this whole kind of ceremony that is performed to extend the sort of formal ritual boundaries of Jerusalem, where you have the king and a prophet and the Urim and Tumim, which were the things that the Kohen Gadol would wear on his breastplate, and the Sanhedrin and multiple todot, multiple thanks offerings, and special songs that were recited. Right? So they talk about this having happened in the times of Ezra when they rededicated the temple, that they sort of performed this ceremony and extended the limits of Jerusalem, even though they didn't have some of the things like the Urim Vitumim, which were lost after the first temple. So the Gemara spends some time sort of talking about the order of procession, how the offerings are made, etc., really getting into some of the fine-grained details. Um, and also when talking about Ezra, it brings up this really interesting sort of question about what does it mean for something to have been consecrated temporarily or indefinitely? Right? That there's a machloket, there's a debate amongst the rabbis as to whether the Kedusha Rishona, the original consecration of Jerusalem and of the land during the times of Joshua, was that Latid Lavo, was that permanent? Or was it Kedusha Deshata? Was it only a temporary Kedusha and one that left once the people were exiled? Right? And a lot of them end up holding, our normative stance ends up being that it was this sort of time-bound sanctification. And it's only when Ezra and the other exiles returned that they sort of had to re-sanctify things in a way that is understood to be more lasting. So it's an interesting sort of tangent, even while we're talking about this question of impurity, purity, consumption, the temple boundaries, we get into these larger questions about how Kedusha, about how sanctity is even established. Um, which, yeah, like it's a fun sort of meta background to all of this. They also talk about what does it mean if you know that the temple is in the area and you know that the temple is sanctified and you know that you can't enter the temple while impure, but you don't know where it is, right? Because this is post-destruction, right? Is that considered to be a lack of awareness? If you're like, you know that the temple exists in the general vicinity and you know that you couldn't enter it, but you're not actually sure where the boundaries are, how does that fit within this paradigm? And the sages really don't know, right? They're constructing most of this at a time where these rules are no longer actually applicable to them because they don't have a Beit HaMikdash, there's no temple, they aren't eating sacrificial offerings. So they're engaging in this theoretical, and there's this little bit that creeps in, this acknowledgement that we are in fact no longer in a time where that's actually applicable and where we actually don't have all of the information for it to even be applied. Um, we also get this question about like, okay, you're not allowed to enter the temple while impure, and you're not allowed to eat things that are sanctified while you're impure. But what happens if you become impure while you're in the temple grounds? They're like, you weren't able to help it, you're inside of the temple, begin menstruating, or somehow like you like how become a zav, like contract gonorrhea, etc. Something, or there's someone who dies around you, right? Something makes you impure. What do you do? Right? And so they say if you leave as quick as you can, if you leave the sort of short way, you're not held liable because there's nothing else you could have done, right? It wasn't your fault that this happened while you were already in the temple. But if you kind of tarry, if you take too long while getting out, you're held responsible because even though you didn't lichatchila, initially decide to enter the temple in this state, you didn't sort of put in the sufficient effort to remove yourself when you needed to. So this becomes it's connected to a very different halacha, a very different rule about nida, about having sex with a menstruating woman, which I'm sure people found to be an interesting and maybe disturbing tangent. That is in fact what we are going to look at a little more in depth. But this law about nida that is mentioned mainly in Masachet Harayot, a tractate that we'll see in a couple months, is sort of compared to the what happens if you're in a place and then impurity occurs, right? It's an interesting sort of comparison, albeit with different outcomes. And finally, we get a new Mishnah, and we're finally talking about Shvuot. I don't know if people felt excited to see that, but like finally in Masechet Shvuot, we start talking about oaths, right? And so we have this notion, there's oaths about what one did in the past, oaths about what one is committing to do in the future, and the idea of being held liable for violating both of those. And also the sort of question of what are the different sort of sub-genres of oath? What's the difference between a false oath and an oath in vain, which is something we'll continue to explore in the next week. And also this kind of question about how much one would need to, for example, consume to be liable for having violated an oath. So a very dense week with a lot of fun material. And I personally am very excited that we're now in the Shvuot section, because I think that the rules of Shvuot are really interesting when thinking about people's intent and the roles of language versus action. Um, I was going to have us look at the sort of distinction between Shvuot Shav and Shvuot Sheker, right? The false versus oath in vain. But I decided since that question really continues to be explored next week, so I'd be giving you a lot of spoilers. I decided to do something that is more contained to our week's topic. So I'm gonna share a link to a source sheet in the chat. And I'm also gonna share my screen. Also, I think a few folks put comments here. There are people who are trying to smuggle in animals to sacrifice on the Temple Mount today. There are a variety of halachic problems with that. The majority of like post-game and the majority of halachic decisors think that this is problematic. And one of the reasons it's problematic is that they say we actually aren't totally confident what the boundaries of different areas of the previous temple complex was. And so if you're not 100% confident about that, you could end up like stepping into an area that you as like a non-Kohen or not the Kohen Gadol are actually liable for death for entering. So that's one issue. There's questions of whether you can sacrifice at all in the absence of an actual temple, whether the actual place is enough. Um, so yes. And someone else asked why we worry about if there's no temple. Um, I think, the question is the rabbis were about to very shortly get into Seder Kodshim, right? The second to last section of the Mishnah, which is entirely about korbanot, entirely about sacrifices, right? So it's an entire section of the Mishnah slash Gemara where the vast majority of content is not applicable to us, right? There's the tractate Chulin, which does have a lot of rules of kashrut that we end up using. But most of them, it's really just about sacrifices, which is not a thing that we're doing anymore. And so this is always the question, the fact that almost all of the rabbis composing this are living at a time where it's no longer actionable. There's sort of different theories about how they're relating to it. The notion that, well, they all sincerely do want this to be reestablished. In the meantime, they want to like hammer out what the rules of it are. There's a real question of if the rabbis are actually trying to impose their own authority over the pre-existing paradigm, right? And presenting halachot, presenting laws and narratives that might not accord with how things actually went, but is kind of a rewriting of the story to present their own authority in contrast to the priestly authority. Um, but they still think that it's worth investigating these halachot because they're a huge part. There's something that comprises a lot of Humash, a lot of the Torah talks a lot about purity and impurity and sacrifices in the temple and the Mishkan. And so the rabbis don't want to leave it untouched. Um, so yeah, there's a lot of interesting thought about this, and I see folks having discussion in the chat. One question about if the temple is rebuilt, would animal sacrifice return? That's a debate. Um, many rabbis say yes. Um, but some, for example, Rav Kook is very, vegetarians really love this. Rav Kook is famous for saying that if the temple was rebuilt, we would only make grain sacrifices, but we would not make animal sacrifice. So that is a point of machloket. Um, with all of that being said, yeah, PETA would not love it. Frankly, I think, if we only if you live in a paradigm like the one that they established where the primary meat eating is only sacrifices, it would probably drastically reduce consumption. But I don't know that we're, for various reasons, going to be moving to that paradigm in the near future. So I'm going to share my screen. And somewhat questionably, I did decide for us to take a look at um, the weirdest clause in our Mishnah that came right before this week. Right now, if folks recall, just to reorient ourselves, right before this, it said the positive mitzvah for which one is not liable were the Sanhedrin to err in their teaching for violating is that if you become impure while inside the temple grounds, uh, you are obligated to take the shortest path out of the temple, right? Again, it's acknowledged that like it's not your fault that this happened, um, but you need to get out of there as quickly as possible. And so because this is connected both in the tractate Harayot and as we'll see sort of thematically, uh, we get this next clause, which says, Ezahi mitzvat aseh shebenida shechayavin aleha. What's the positive mitzvah with regard to a menstruating woman, for which one is liable? Chaya mishamesh im haTorah va'amra lo nitmeti uperesh miyad chayav mifnei sheyitziato hana'a lo kubiato. If one is having sex with a woman who was pure, and while they were having sex, she said, I have become impure, i.e., my period has started, and he immediately withdrew from her, he is liable to bring a sin offering because his withdrawal is as pleasant as his entering, right? So you can see that the Sfaria adds in words that are not here, which is that he withdraws immediately as opposed to waiting until he becomes placid. And so the notion is that because the withdrawal is a pleasurable act, it is considered its own act effectively of having sex. And she is now in nida, and so he is liable. Um, Interested in what folks thought when they were first I mean, someone already put this the discussing one of the cringiest passages. It is pretty cringy. You can't wait until Masechet Nida will have an entire tractate about this. But I'm interested in what folks thought with like when this first came up in the Mishnah in the midst of all our other like discussions about purity and impurity. People can either put in the chat or if you want to raise your hand, can share in person. Did most people just think this is really cringy and uncomfortable? Yeah, it definitely illustrates the point of becoming pure and pure, but oy vey, right? The thing, um, sometimes it feels like the rabbis just feel like taking a break. Yeah, someone said house equals wife. There is this like very direct parallel being made, which is you can see it as in some ways slightly more dignified than the way in which in Tractate Nida, they will compare a woman's body slash reproductive system to a house, including mentioning body parts that aren't there. Whereas here, the woman's body is actually being kind of compared to the temple, right? That like the comparison is, the person who enters the temple while pure becomes impure while in the temple and has to exit in the proper way. So a person, quote unquote, enters the woman while she is pure, while she is not menstruating, and what is the proper way of exiting when she becomes impure during that. Um, Somebody talking about like, yeah, the rabbis are very willing to talk about bodily functions. Now, of course, they're talking about it amongst themselves, right? So there is an acknowledgement of what the rabbis are willing to discuss with each other versus what they would be willing to discuss with women, for example. Not always the same, but they're very comfortable talking in explicit detail about bodies and sex. Um, the emphasis is very much on the pleasure of intercourse, right? Because they the actual being in contact with Nida blood, right? Being in physical contact with menstrual blood is not in self a transgression, right? There's not actually anything prohibiting you from being in contact with menstrual blood, right? It makes you impure, but people aren't commanded to not become impure, right? You're commanded, other than like you have exceptions like the Nazir or certain Kohanim, but like if you're just an average Joe, you aren't supposed to enter the temple while impure. You're not supposed to eat consecrated foods while impure, but you're not forbidden from becoming impure. And again, a lot of times that happens due to things that are either uncontrollable or desirable, right? Like menstruation and sex and childbirth. Um, and so the rabbi sort of preference him being in longer contact, as it were, with the menstrual blood over the experience of like having a more pleasurable sexual experience. Because the isser, the prohibition about the interaction is the prohibition of having sex with somebody who is in nida. Um, they do not seem, you're asked if they're worried about the woman at all or just her partner. In our discussion, they unfortunately do not really mention the woman's experience of it, other than the fact that we see her say that she is impure. There is the interesting fact that once a woman says she's in nida, she is considered to be in nida even in the absence of any other proof. If a woman says, I'm in nida, her husband is now forbidden to have sex with her. So there's interesting questions about some level of agency there and women kind of like stating their own status. Um, but yes, it definitely is very much male oriented. It is focused on what he is doing while they are in the midst of sex, not really what her experience is. Um, Okay, so much more to say, but I want us to look, there's an interesting sort of discussion about how and why people are liable in this case. Um, okay, so actually it looks like I put this thing twice, so we're going to continue. On 17b, we have in the name of Abaye, I think I just, for sake of time, read in English. Abaye says in the name of Rabbi Chia Barav, one is liable to bring two sin offerings for this unwitting transgression. And so Rava says, Rav Shmuel Bar Shaba says, Rav Huna says, he's liable to bring two sin offerings, one for his initial entry and one for his immediate withdrawal. So they're saying again, in this case of somebody who had sex with his wife while she was not yet menstruating, she began menstruating and then he withdrew immediately, he's liable for two different sin offerings. And Rabbah is kind of confused about this, right? Rabbah says, what's the case we're speaking about? If we say it was near her expected date of menstruation, who are the subjects of this law? If we're dealing with a Torah scholar, then granted they would be liable to bring a sin offering for the entry for initially having sex, because that was an unintentional transgression, right? He thought to himself, she's like close to her period, but like I think I can have sex with her before she begins to menstruate, right? So that was like he was not intentionally deciding to have sex with a menstruant. He just sort of inaccurately calculated their timing. But why will he be liable to bring a sin offering for his immediate withdrawal? That transgression is intentional, since he is a Torah scholar and knows that in such a case he must not withdraw immediately, right? And sin offerings are only given for something one did unintentionally or unknowingly. But if this person is a Talmid Chacham and they know that the law is that you're not allowed to withdraw immediately because of the pleasure that you're supposed to remain until one becomes flaccid, then him withdrawing is actually a bemazed violation. It is an intentional transgression. And he should be liable for karet. He should be liable for spiritual excision for that, not for a sin offering. Right? So if we're dealing with the Talmid Chacham, we have an issue because he would be owed one sin offering and one helping of karet, not two sin offerings. And if we say we're dealing with an Am Haaretz, somebody who's sort of considered to be uninformed, then for both this and that, both having sex and immediately withdrawing, he should be only liable to bring one sin offering because he had no idea that he was transgressing in either case, right? This is like one who ate two olive bulks of forbidden fat in the course of one lapse of awareness and is liable to only bring one sin offering, right? The Am Haaretz didn't know that she was menstruating when they started having sex, and he didn't know that it was prohibited for him to withdraw. So there's only one sort of lapse of knowledge here, right? So that person would also only be liable for one sin offering. How do we end up with a person who is not liable for karet, but is liable for two separate transgressions, right? So they say, rather, it must be a case where it was not near her expected date of menstruation. And so the person had no reason to think that the woman would experience menstruation. It was completely beyond their expectation that she would start her period. But now the Gemara says, who are we dealing with here? If we're dealing with a Torah scholar, they shouldn't be liable to bring any sin offering, right? Because when they first had sex, he was a victim of circumstances beyond his control, right? This concept of onus, right? Where if there's something that you truly could not have predicted, it's like the person is liable for having had sex with the woman who's about to menstruate, because even if they weren't planning to have sex with a menstruant woman, they should have known better, right? There's this rabbinic prohibition on having sex in the immediate, yeah, like lead up to her period because such a situation could occur. But if it's like 10 days before her period's supposed to start, then he shouldn't be liable for anything for initially having sex with her because they had no reason to expect that this would occur, right? They're completely exempt from that. And then when it comes to his withdrawal, that's also, as we established, considered intentional because he knows that's forbidden. And so he would just be liable for one helping of karet, but no sin offerings. And if we're dealing with an Am Haaretz, he should be liable again to bring only one sin offering for, again, the immediate withdrawal, which is the only thing that was a problem in this circumstance. So Rava amends our situation. He says, actually, it's a case where it was near the expected date of the woman's menstruation, and we're dealing with a Torah scholar. But he's a Torah scholar only with regard to this halacha, that it's prohibited to engage in intercourse with the woman near the expected onset of her menstruation. But he is not a Torah scholar with regard to that halacha, that it is prohibited for one to immediately withdraw from a woman if she begins menstruating during intercourse. So someone asked, are the rabbis telling us who's responsible? The women, like both the women and men, are expected to be keeping track of the woman's normative cycle. Um, Somebody said it seems intuitive to run away fast when one made a mistake, like running out of the temple, right? That they make this comparison, that it's actually sort of flipped, which is that in the temple, you're supposed to get out of there as fast as you can. Whereas here, Dafka, the opposite, you're supposed to stay. And the longer version is what is considered more permissible. Um, but I think that Rava's point here is really fascinating because this is the rabbis, they're struggling a lot throughout this entire chapter with questions about what level of knowledge and awareness do we expect people to have. And so often we create this kind of binary between a Talmid Chacham and an Am Haaretz, between a scholar and an ignoramus, as it's often translated, and being like, the scholars know all the laws, so they're liable for violating them. And the Amei Haaretz know none of them, so like they'll have no knowledge of their violation. And Rav is like, it's actually a little bit more complicated than that, right? It's not actually such a straightforward binary. There are some Talmidei Chachamim who might know that it's prohibited to have sex with a woman right before her period starts, but wouldn't know about this like prohibition on withdrawing immediately. As somebody pointed out, if they hadn't learned that halacha, it feels way more intuitive that withdrawing immediately would be the correct thing to do. Right? So Rav is indicating for us that a person knowing some of these laws is not actually a guarantee that they know all of them. And I think that leads to this admittedly very funny bit that comes in Amud later, where Rabbi Yonatan ben Yossi ben Lakonia asked Rabbi Shimon ben Yossi ben Lakonia, so two brothers seemingly, from where in the Torah is the prohibition concerning one who engages in intercourse with a menstruating woman? Rabbi Shimon ben Yossi ben Lakunya took a clod of earth and threw it at him in reproach and said, "Is there a need to search the Torah for a derivation for the prohibition on engaging with having sex with a nida? The verse says, and a woman who is impure by her uncleanness you shall not approach." Right? At first glance, Rabbi Yonatan here asked an incredibly silly question. Right? There's an explicit prohibition on having sex with a menstruant woman in the Torah. So anybody who is a rabbi, who has smicha, who is a Talmid Chacham, obviously should know why one is prohibited from having sex with a menstruate woman, right? It's just explicitly in the Torah. So they say, this guy isn't so stupid. He must have been asking something different. Rather, he asked, from where do we derive the prohibition with regard to the case where one was engaging in intercourse with a pure woman and then she experienced bleeding, the law that he must not withdraw immediately. And so Chizkiah gives this derivation of her menstrual flow is upon him, i.e., even when it is physically upon him, the prohibition of having sex, i.e., withdrawing, applies. Um, so this thing, I think, again, it's really fascinating when it comes to what laws we expect people to really be holding in, to be familiar with, right? We've mentioned that this came up in our Mishnah because it was compared to the temple becoming impure in the temple in the tractate Harayot, right? That tractate, which we'll see soon, is about what happens if the Sanhedrin rules incorrectly about something and everyone follows them and then they realize their error, right? When are they liable to bring this communal sin offering to atone for the fact that they made the entire community sin? And one thing it says there is that the Sanhedrin isn't liable if they told you to do something that is explicitly forbidden in the Torah, right? If the Sanhedrin just said, go have sex with a woman in Nida, then people can't really, with a straight face, say that they were doing that on the authority of the Sanhedrin because they could just open a Tanakh and know that that's not permitted, right? So it's only considered to be a case where they led the community astray if it's a rule that's kind of based in Torah but requires derivation, right? So one like our very obscure example here, where the person is having sex with a pure woman, she starts menstruating, and then he has to withdraw slowly. That's something that we're like people wouldn't necessarily be versed in. Um, somebody asked, is the point that we shouldn't ridicule someone for asking a dumb question? I'm actually not sure that that is the point because they basically seem to say if it was a dumb question, he deserved ridicule, but we hold him in high enough esteem that we assume he was asking not a dumb question, right? That basically we sort of don the cuff sklut. We have a generous interpretation of people to assume they're asking a smart question. Um, so somebody said the rationale for waiting is because the idea you shouldn't derive benefit. Correct, right? The idea that having a pleasurable interaction that involves having been penetrating or withdrawing is considered to constitute sex, right? So just as um, penetration is considered to constitute sex, withdrawing with an erect penis is considered to constitute sex. Therefore, if she is menstruating, he had sex with a menstruating woman. In a way that if the penis is flaccid, they're like, since there isn't as much pleasure occurring, it's not considered as if he did an active sex while she was menstruating. Someone mentioned the possibility of ejaculating outside, which also is an interesting possibility of concern, right? That if you immediately withdraw, I think that's very smart. I don't see the rabbis mention that, but I think that might be underlying some of the concern, right? Because that's a real possibility if you have people withdraw completely amidst the act. Um, Obviously we're at 10, but this is like I think both again, an upsetting topic in a lot of ways, but I think a really rich one when we're talking about like what sort of levels of knowledge the rabbis assume people have, right? What are things that that are considered to be beyond our control that like you shouldn't be considered to um create boundaries around versus what are things that even if it's an unideal circumstance, you're expected to be prepared for and to know how to deal with. And what do we expect that even learned people know or don't know? Um, If somebody asked if Orthodox husbands have menstrual calendar apps. Some may, right? It's very practical. Like if you know, okay, I'm set to start my period tomorrow, then it's considered to be like samuch lebista, right? Her period's about to begin, and you're not supposed to have sex lest it come early. Um, yeah. Can you imagine a teenage boy in yeshiva? Yeah, some of the yeshivot dafka try and avoid this content because they are concerned about the ways that teenage boys will engage with it. But some of them do get into it, and as a woman, I have no idea what they say because I'm not allowed in those spaces, but I imagine it is interesting. Um, shkoyach to everybody. This was lovely learning with you all.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Boatsum. Thanks for being with us, everybody, and we'll see you next week. Take care.